Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another exciting week of American History 2. Hopefully, again, I didn't get started in mid sentence, but if I did, once again, you should be here as always for American History 2. This week, we're going to wrap up the Gilded Age, get into progressivism a little bit, and we'll end this week talking about World War I, which, judging by what of your final essay topics are looking up to be, should be pretty useful for a lot of you. So make sure you especially pay attention this week. Again, judging from what I've heard of a lot of your final essay potential topics, a lot of you could benefit potentially from progressivism as well, but definitely a lot of you from World War I. Now, as always, of course, we are going to start things off with the key terms. Today, we're going to be looking at some things called the political machines. We're looking at muckraking / the jungle specifically, which is a horribly depressing but great book. I recommend you check out if you don't mind that sort of thing. We'll, of course, be looking a bit at progressivism as a whole. We'll be looking at some of the prohibition and temperance movements in this country, and we'll wrap things up with something called the Wisconsin idea. Now, as always, before I get more into detail about our content for today, I of course do want to make sure you're aware of some important upcoming assignments. As I'm sure you're all aware at this point, your first debate is your materials are going to be due on October the 2nd at 5 p.m. Now, one thing I want to stress once again is that the prompt, rubric, and submission area can already be found on Moodle. They've been there the whole semester, so if you have any questions about the prompt or the alternate assignment, please go check that as soon as possible. Now, again, to remind you all, for the debate, if you're doing the alternate assignment, it will be turned in the exact same place as the debate materials. Everyone's stuff is getting turned in the exact same place. Now, if you're going to be in the actual debate, all of the debate work will be done in class, and like I said, we'll just turn in the materials on that day. As you all should have seen in my emails by now, our planned debate is to be on September the 29th, but whatever you do, the live debate or the alternate assignment, those materials will all be due this Friday. Now, to help to ease your mind a little bit, you have nothing else due this week, so this debate is the only real assignment you need to worry about this week. Your next major assignment is, of course, your next content quiz. That'll come up next Friday. That will be posted in the week folder for that week, which is week 7. I just realized I think I already made a mistake. This is week 6. Please excuse me. But either way, this will be in the week 7 folder. It's due October the 9th at 5 p.m. Lastly, your midterm writing assignment is still several weeks off, but it would be a good idea to go ahead and start looking at it. It is due on October the 25th at 5 p.m. I especially want to stress at this assignment that it is also, the prompt and rubric are already also located in Moodle. Please make sure you look at this assignment ahead of time, please. I've had a few people mention to me that one reason they struggled a bit with this last writing assignment 2, is that they didn't look at the prompt beforehand and weren't aware that it was a lot bigger than the first writing assignment. So please make sure you look at the prompt ahead of time so you're prepared and you can come up with more of a detailed work plan on how much you plan to get done every day, so you don't have to try to write a large writing assignment in a single day. So yeah, please make sure that does not happen. Try to get prepared for this and be aware of what I expect as soon as possible. As always, of course, I'm very open to any questions you might have. You can run rough drafts by me, send thesis statements, all that fun stuff. But please, I can't stress this enough, go ahead and look at the prompt and the rubric as soon as you can, so you're as prepared as possible. Now, in the meantime, I do want to make sure you review a little bit of what we talked about last week with populism. Please remember some of the political responses we talked about that people had to the Gilded Age, and think about, as we go throughout this class, what might be some of their other options in order to deal with the problems of the Gilded Age. Now, to start things off, I want to look a little bit more in detail at unions and why they have issues in America. We ended last class talking a bit about some of the failed protests and strikes that unions had in this country. Now, you might be wondering why unions are so unsuccessful typically, even though they seem to have a pretty noble purpose, you could argue. Well, there's a few reasons historians have identified that unions particularly struggle in America. One is the typical action of the state and federal government. As a reminder from last week, when the state and federal government got involved in strikes, what usually happened? Awkward pause for the audience again. My favorite and least favorite part of teaching online. But yes, as you would hopefully remember, they typically take the side of the corporation. Because as we mentioned, They consider a lot of times these corporations to be very useful and important for the country, so they typically want to make sure these companies get back to work as soon as possible. So the government is usually going to take the side of breaking up the strike. Blacklisting was also another very major or very common practice during this time period. Blacklisting is where if someone was identified as being part of a union, their bosses would spread their name out to everyone else involved in the industry or similar industries and essentially blacklist them by not letting them work anywhere in this industry again. So, for example, you might have heard similar things in like Hollywood or acting, for example. If there's an actor who gets a reputation for a bad attitude or for a bad work ethic, something like that, they might lose acting opportunities. Same thing happened here with workers who got involved in unions. If you were caught being in a union a lot of the time, you couldn't get any work, so no one was willing to join unions. Radical violence, as we mentioned a little bit last time, was a big deal as well. For example, as you can see in this picture here, one of the most infamous acts of Union violence was the Haymarket bombing in 1886, when several bystanders, and including a couple police officers, were injured and killed. So remember from last week, and take it to modern present day, for example. Why is radical violence a lot of times, or violence, radical, I guess it depends on the point of view, but why can violence be such a huge issue for a lot of these movements? Awkward pause again. Yeah, again, think of modern social issues. Why is violence? Why is violence such an issue with that? All right, yes, very good imaginary class. A lot of times, violence is obviously violence can be very scary when you see it out in the streets. It seems chaotic, anarchist, and opponents of these social movements can a lot of times use it as an excuse to discredit them, whether they deserve it or not. To a certain extent, especially with modern issues, that's up to you. But the point is, it does make an easy target for people to criticize. Finally, as we've mentioned a little bit with racial politics as well, and with fusion politics, the rising immigrant and free black population, I dropped something, sorry. But yeah, the rising immigrant and free black population was such a big deal as well. Remember from what we talked about a little while ago, when people saw all these free African Americans, what did that scare them of, or what were they scared of? Yes, again, very good job, imaginary class. So yeah, with the free black population, you're still scared of Negro equality or Negro rule, as they would oftentimes call it. Most people in the country still weren't ready to give African Americans equality, so a lot of times when these African Americans would try to get involved in unions, it just gave them another target for people to attack who wanted to discredit unions. Now, to get into a little bit more of the other problems we didn't have time last week to talk about in the Gilded Age. One of the major problems for the Gilded people in the Gilded Age were political machines. Political machines, as you may have heard, were organizations that traded jobs and favors for votes. So essentially, they'd give you a job, they'd help out your business or help out some problem you had. In return, you voted for the candidate and or the political party they wanted you to. For example, one of the most infamous political machines in American history was Tammany Hall in New York. This group specifically worked with lower class immigrants in New York. Why would lower class immigrants particularly be receptive and a good target for these machines? It's times like this when I miss an actual class. But yes, as you might have realized, I basically answered that question in the last one. These rising immigrants were a lot of times barred from unions. They lacked job opportunities that other people in the country had. So they would be much more willing to work with the political machine in order to just put food on the table. So because of that, there were actually some arguable benefits from political machines. They were pretty famous for providing jobs and services for immigrants that no one was willing to give them. However, it also led to some negatives, which you can see depicted in this political cartoon right here. Like, how would this depict a political machine? Is this sort of a positive thing? All right, very good. Yeah, probably a pretty obvious question, imaginary audience. So yeah, you had this tentacled monster reaching out and grabbing people using things like blackmail, tax departments, the fire department, even getting involved in the building department. They're essentially using all these services they provide to people to latch on to people and force them into a state of dependency. So they have to rely on these political machines to survive. So therefore, they have to do basically exactly whatever they want. So because of that, these political machines often became very corrupt and especially allowed for corporate investment into voting and the misuse of funds. So this, of course, is going to make the government even more on the side of corporations because these political machines and the corporate influence are going to directly influence politics now. So it's not going to be very easy to get any change and to improve things in the Gilded Age. However, there were a couple of ways that people were able to resist some of these social influences. One of the most important is muckraking. Muckraking is journalism that is specifically dedicated to exposing what the writer sees as certain social evils. A couple of major examples in America. Jacob Riss wrote How the Other Half Lives in order to expose slum conditions. Because as you might imagine, when urbanization kicked off and these cities were growing, a lot of, again, these poor immigrant and free black populations lived in terrible slums. This book was dedicated to exposing what those conditions were like. Lincoln Steffens also wrote The Shame of the Cities to expose municipal corruption, so essentially corruption in local and state governments. However, the most infamous and well-known, which many of you have probably even heard of, at the very least maybe in an English class, of muckraking is The Jungle, written by Upton Sinclair in 1906. Now, if you've done the reading, which hopefully you have at this point, if you haven't, please do it as soon as possible. You at the very least need to be prepared to explain what this book was investigating. Why did Upton Sinclair write it? Now, more specifically, I do have a few review questions I want you to look at while you're doing this reading to make sure you're prepared to discuss it on future assignments. Now, to be prepared, like I said, be prepared to answer these questions. What was Jurgis's job like? So again, Jurgis is one of the main characters. To give you a little bit of insight, if you haven't read this yet, he's working in one of these industries that's popping up in the Gilded Age. Now, not only look at what his job was like, look at how he reacted to this job. That might give you a bit of a better idea of what the immigrant mindset was like when they were having to deal with jobs in this Gilded Age world. Now, also I want you to look at the purchase of the house in this chapter. The chapter I'm assigning you to read from this book talks a lot about the family trying to purchase a house. Think about what this purchase symbolizes. To give you a bit of a hint on where to look, remember what the definition of the Gilded Age actually means. It's something that appears great on the outside, but on the inside is full of corruption and decay. Think of what this buying of the house in this story might have to do with that. Finally, big theme for a lot of this semester, look at who benefits from capitalism in this chapter, and look at who does not benefit from capitalism in this chapter. Be prepared to give pretty good answers on all these questions. They will come up on future assignments. In the meantime, we can go ahead and skip to looking at the impact of the jungle. Now, this might give away one of the questions I asked earlier, but that's okay. Like I said, hopefully you've already done the reading for the jungle before you look at this PowerPoint. But one of the immediate impacts was just later that same year, the Meat Inspection Act was passed in 1906. The Department of Agriculture, this law said that the Department of Agriculture had the right to prevent bad or mislabeled meat from entering domestic or international commerce. However, meat packing plants also won the right to make the federal government pay for the inspections. So, why might that be a problem? As I wait again like a James Bond villain. But yeah, as you might see, it's sort of an incomplete victory. Because on the one hand, they are no longer allowed to mislabel meat, but it's up to the federal government to finance all these inspections. This could mean that inspections are going to be a little less frequent because the federal government might not be willing or able to foot the bill for all these inspections. So again, you officially can't mislabel the meat anymore, but it's a bit hard to have oversight to make sure they're following the law. Later that same year as well, the Pure Food and Drug Act was also passed in 1906. This prevented this mislabeling of food and drugs, and also resulted in the formation of the FDA, which I'm sure you've all heard of. Now, one thing I actually thought was interesting is that instead of this whole crisis lowering the buying of meat and prescription drugs, it actually increased sales. Why might that be the case? Gotta save my voice. But yes, as you might imagine, it actually inspired consumer confidence in the product. This might be a bit of a random example, but some of my more nerd students in here might get this reference. Some of you might remember when the very first Sonic trailer came out for that movie last year, and the CGI and the computer generated Sonic looked pretty terrible. As some of you might know, the company then responded by redoing the computer animation to make Sonic look much better. After that, I saw many people that I know personally and across the internet saying that they were just going to buy tickets to that movie because they were happy that the studio listened to them. This is a very similar situation. People felt like their concerns were being listened to and that their products they were buying were being improved, so they were actually much more willing ultimately to purchase more of these products. However, one interesting thing that's worth noting about the jungle is that in actuality, the public was more outraged at meat condition than workers' conditions. Sinclair wrote that he had aimed for the public's, or said once that he had aimed for the public's heart by trying to expose the terrible working conditions, but by accident he hit their stomachs. So again, essentially, they cared more about their food conditions than they cared about what working conditions were like for these immigrants. So again, how does that show the problems or potential issues with muckraking? It's a habit, I can't help it. But yeah, as you might guess again, this just sort of shows the limitations of appealing to the public sometimes. Even though even any kind of social activism or political activism has to deal with this. No matter what you do, you may not be able to get the public invested and on your side. Sinclair was able to do it, but he wasn't able to accomplish exactly what he wanted and didn't have much of a direct impact on workers' conditions, which was his ultimate goal in the first place. So it shows again, no matter what you do, it is difficult to get the public on your side occasionally, if not all the time. But now, of course, the progressive era is the main thing we're looking at, and the jungle being one of the main examples of attempting to pull this off. The progressive era is typically said to have lasted from 1900 to 1917. Progressivism itself is the belief that society can improve through collective action. So if we all work together, we might improve society together. One of the first examples of trying to bring this about actually occurred in 1889 with Hull House. This was a house in Chicago which provided job training and housing for the poor. Now, as a bit of a review, why might this be seen by by fans of the progressive era, as more effective than the gospel of wealth? Remember what we talked about last week about some of the perceived disadvantages of Carnegie's gospel of wealth. That might be a bit hard for us to remember at this point, but do make sure you remember that. But yeah, if you remember, one of the downfalls, arguably, of the gospel of wealth was that it didn't provide direct aid to the poor or disenfranchised groups. It just improved things like schools and universities and hospitals and great concert halls that a lot of these poor people wouldn't have access to anyway. Proponents of things like progressivism and the social gospel, as you'll see in a second, will oftentimes would argue that this gave more direct benefit and direct aid to the poor people that they could make use of immediately. The social gospel became very popular during this time period. The social gospel was essentially a belief shared by a variety of denominations that stated that Christ wanted Christians to reach out to the lower classes. So it wasn't just about evangelism anymore necessarily. It was about specifically reaching out and providing aid to various lower class individuals. For example, the Young Men's Christian Organization, YMCA, was founded in 1844 in London. The Salvation Army was founded in 1865 in London. Now, we really haven't had time to talk about this, but can anyone guess why these organizations were founded specifically in London around the same time? What was going on in London during this time period? This is a bit of a world history review, those of you who've been in world history before. Don't disappoint your old instructors. But yeah, as many of you probably are aware, even if you haven't had world civilizations yet, this is around the time when the Industrial Revolution was going on. So more and more people are getting into the factory workforce. They're working in meatpacking plants like the one in the jungle. So more people are having to deal with all these different issues and providing job training, housing, all that fun stuff. So these organizations seem much more relevant. Now, also want to look at social progressivism for a minute. One of the main aspects of the social progressive movement was the prohibition, also known as temperance movement. Anybody who in there who can tell me who or what prohibition is? Imaginary class is not actually here. Yeah, those of you who, as we'll hopefully talk about a little bit when we have time, those of you who especially are fans of NASCAR should be aware of this. As we'll talk about in a week or so, Prohibition is actually what's credited with starting NASCAR, but we'll get there in a little bit. Yeah, for those of you who don't know, Prohibition is, of course, the movement to outlaw alcohol consumption and alcohol sales. Some people consider this to be a very important social reform that would improve society as a whole. To give you a hint on why some people thought this was so important, take a look at this photo right here, or this drawing right here. What's going on? All right, yes, very good imaginary class. As you can see, you can essentially see a person over time being destroyed by their alcoholism. So you have a nice gentleman here just taking a sip of alcohol. Now he's out stepping out on his wife, getting involved in physical altercations, drinking and smoking with questionable individuals. Then he starts to decline. He's getting all smelly and dirty, losing his clothes, and finally, bam, even taking his own life in this instance. Now, that of course seems bad enough on its own, but if you see down here, who is the victim of all of this? Obviously, yes, women and children. Many women especially started to become more politically active because of what they saw as alcohol's violent impacts upon the social life of America, specifically focused on the plight of women and children suffering under alcoholic husbands and fathers. So because of this, women started to get a lot more involved in these kind of things. For example, in 1900, the Women's Christian Temperance Movement was formed, and in 1900, the Anti-Saloon League was formed. Because of this political involvement that women started to get more active in, it also encouraged many women to get involved in the women's suffrage movement. Can anyone tell me what the women's suffrage movement is back home? Alright, yeah, this is a pretty commonly known one as well. This, of course, is the campaign to give women the right to vote. A couple of our first famous female suffragists. You have, of course, Susan B. Anthony, who is from lived between 1820 and 1906, who began her career actually as an anti-abolitionist and temperance activist. So again, like I said, many of these women got their start working with prohibition movements, got a taste of politics, started campaigning for the right to vote. Elizabeth C. Stanton was active around the same time. She was also an abolitionist and is famous for writing the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848, which laid out the various reasons women deserve the right to vote. Now, this is just something I wanted to focus on very quickly. This shows actually a pretty common campaign method of these female suffragist movements. Now, another reason, or not female suffragist, temperance movements. Now, another reason I wanted to focus on this is this again stresses the female impact of alcoholism and the temperance movement. Women took the lead in these organizations because they again were the ones who felt that they were the most victimized by society's issues with alcoholism. And so many of them were, of course, willing to take the leap to say they would not have any relations whatsoever with men who are involved with alcohol, which might not be that bad of an idea when you think about it. But yes, this just shows again, women were very involved and the leaders of these movements. Lastly, we'll look a bit at political progressivism before we start wrapping up the Gilded Age. Essentially, political progressivism was dedicated to trying to end some of the, as you mentioned earlier, the inefficiencies and the corruption of these political machines. A few examples of how they tried to do this. They came up with something called the Scientific Management or Galveston Plan, which was just an idea to have a more organized plan for city management. So instead of leaving it to these political machines or individuals who just bought their seats with corruption, bribery, or some kind of favor, you would have more organized and qualified individuals. For example, city managers started popping up during this time. So, like I said again, you would have qualified and trained individuals managing your city instead of just the richest or most corrupt person you could find. The Wisconsin idea was also popularized during this time. This was where university research was decided that it should assist the government in protecting people's health, the environment, agriculture, and people's quality of life. A couple of examples for how they did this. This is where primary elections became a thing. Why would primary elections be such a benefit to people? Arguably, I know our primaries were a bit of a mess this year, arguably, but why are primary elections supposed to benefit people? All right, well, for those of you who aren't aware of what primary elections are first, this is where political parties essentially pick the candidates that they're going to have run for office. So, for example, Joe Biden is running for president this year for the Democratic Party because he won the Democratic Party's primary elections. More Democrats voted for him to be their candidate than anyone else. So, this is supposed to give the voters more control over their political party and their political candidates. Instead of just having the party pick its own people to run, the voters now get to decide who's going to run. Workers' compensation also happened around this time, along with this increased state regulation of railroads. There is a direct election of U.S. senators for the first time. Instead of the state governments selecting their senators, again, people now have more control over their government because they get to vote for the senators. And finally, the 16th Amendment was eventually passed, which led to a graduated income tax. Anybody know what that is? Awkward pause for the audience again. Yes, very good imaginary student. So yeah, the graduated income tax is where the more money you make, the more percentage of your paycheck is taken away for taxes. So this is supposed to benefit the poorer classes by taxing them less than the people who have a little bit more to spare. Now, last thing we'll look at is just a little bit of the progressive presidents. Theodore Roosevelt was considered a progressive president from 1901 to 1908. He participated in trust busting, or trying to break up some of these corporations and prevent them from forming monopolies. He also authorized the infamous Panama Canal, which improved trading and international trading. And he, possibly most importantly, is responsible for 125 million acres of American land being set aside for national parks. William Howard Taft was a bit less aggressive from 1909 to 1913. He was more of a consolidate, don't extend reform individual. Instead of trying to extend what Theodore Roosevelt did, he just wanted to consolidate it and prevent anyone from undoing what Roosevelt did. Finally, Woodrow Wilson was president from 1913 to 1921. Interestingly, he was the first Southern Democrat to become president since the Civil War. He also came up with the Federal Reserve System to improve banking in the United States, and he also is the one who authorized that graduated income tax we mentioned earlier. All right, so again, that's about all we have for progressivism today. Keep that in mind. Fighting against social ills and economic inequality is going to be a big theme for the rest of this course. But in the meantime, do remember that you have these upcoming assignments. Please let me know if you have any other questions about them. But otherwise, have a great rest of your day, and make sure you ask any questions you have as soon as possible about the debate. Thank you.